The sun had not yet fully risen when Agrippina's screams echoed through the halls of the imperial villa in Anzio. Servants rushed back and forth, carrying jugs of warm water, linen cloths, and aromatic herbs. The labor was difficult, but on that morning of August 31st, 12 AD, Rome would gain a new heir. When the baby finally came into the world, his first cry was loud, almost defiant. It was as if he already knew he would have to fight to survive. In the hands of one of the midwives, a healthy, robust child with alert eyes and rosy skin. His birth was met with joy, but also expectation. After all, he was no ordinary boy. He was a direct descendant of Augustus, the adopted grandson of Emperor Tiberius, and the son of Germanicus, the general who inspired loyalty and passion like few others in Rome. While Agrippina, exhausted, held the newborn in her arms, one certainty filled the room. This boy was destined for greatness. The omens were favorable. The family's astrologer, an old man with a white beard and piercing gaze, murmured words of good fortune. But behind the scenes of power, where intrigues entwined like serpents, there were also those who viewed his birth with different eyes. The little Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus was a symbol of continuity and glory for some, but a veiled threat for others. His father, adored by the soldiers and respected by the people, was seen by many as the true leader Rome needed. The man who could replace Tiberius. And now, this heir of pure blood had come into the world to reinforce that expectation even further. The coming years would show that being born amidst greatness was both a blessing and a curse. This boy, still fragile and innocent, would grow under the weight of the name he carried. But the empire was cruel, and Rome, which today celebrated his birth, would one day fear him. His early years were marked by the luxury and prestige of an imperial family. In the palaces of Rome, where marble gleamed beneath golden torches and the aroma of eastern spices filled the air, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus grew up surrounded by attentive servants, demanding tutors, and powerful relatives. But his true home was not there. From an early age, fate led him to a different setting. Not the opulent halls of the Senate, but the military camps on the empire's borders. His father, Germanicus, was not a man who ruled from the comfort of the city. He was a commander who marched with his troops, a leader loved by soldiers, who preferred the dirt floors of a military tent to the silk cushions of Rome. And it was in this environment that Caligula grew up. Still a child, he began to accompany his father on campaigns along the Rhine's banks, where Roman legions faced the Germanic tribes. Unlike other elite children, who spent their childhood playing in the palace gardens, he grew up among spears and shields, listening to tales of battle around campfires, observing the legionaries' drills, learning to respect the discipline that made Rome invincible. The soldiers quickly became fond of him. There was something captivating about the boy with the lively gaze, who wandered curiously through the camps, mimicking his father's gestures. To them, he was more than the son of Germanicus. He was a symbol of hope, a sign that Rome's future would be in good hands. To show their affection, they gave him a nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, referring to the small military sandals he wore, a miniature version of the soldier's footwear. But if the legionaries saw it as a gesture of affection, for Caligula himself, it was more than just a name. It was a baptism, a seal of belonging to the army he so admired. Among the battle-hardened warriors, he was not treated as a distant prince, but as one of them. He grew up believing that the soldier's loyalty was more valuable than any vote from the Senate, a lesson that years later would shape his reign, for better or worse. There, in the cold of the campaigns, amidst the sounds of swords being sharpened and orders shouted into the air, the boy who would one day rule Rome was being formed. But fate still had challenges in store for him. And before becoming emperor, he would need to face something far more dangerous than the barbarians at the borders: the deadly game of Roman politics. Fate can be cruel, and Caligula would learn that too soon. His father, Germanicus, was more than a successful general. He was a hero to Rome, a man whose popularity threatened even Emperor Tiberius. And like everything that shines too brightly in the empire, he became the target of the shadows that lurked around power. In 19 AD, Germanicus was sent to the east on a diplomatic mission. Rome needed to ensure the stability of the provinces, and no one was better suited than him to represent imperial authority. But the trip that should have solidified his prestige turned into a nightmare. A few months after arriving in Syria, Germanicus suddenly fell ill. The reports from the Times speak of a high fever, unbearable pain, and a rapid decline that seemed unnatural. Rumors began to circulate. They said his food and water had been poisoned, that spells had been cast against him. Some claimed to have found cursed symbols in his home, signs that dark forces were involved. But the most dangerous suspicion fell on one name: Tiberius. The emperor, who ruled Rome with coldness and distance, already saw Germanicus as a threat. After all, he was young, charismatic, and beloved by the soldiers, the very type of man who could replace him. Agonizing on his deathbed, Germanicus could not accept the injustice. Feeling the end approaching, he called his most loyal friends and made one request: that they avenge his death, that they not leave his family unprotected. And then, at the age of 33, Rome's greatest hero passed away. The news devastated the empire. The people wept in the streets. The soldiers struck their swords against their shields in mourning. His body was brought back to Rome, where a grand funeral was held. But what should have been a moment of farewell turned into the spark of a crisis. Agrippina, his widow, publicly accused Tiberius of being responsible for her husband's death. The Senate murmured, the Praetorian Guard watched. And in the midst of this turmoil stood Caligula, a 7-year-old boy, watching his world crumble. His father, the man he idolized, was dead, and not in an honorable way on the battlefield, but victimized by betrayals and invisible poisons. His childlike heart did not yet fully understand the gears of power, but a seed was planted in his mind. Rome was not governed only by laws and swords, but by conspiracies and poisons served in golden cups. From that day on, nothing would ever be the same. The death of Germanicus was not only a tragedy for Rome, it was the beginning of an unrelenting hunt. With the absence of the people's hero, his family became a nuisance to Emperor Tiberius. And in Rome, a nuisance never went unpunished. Agrippina, devastated by the loss of her husband, refused to bow down. She was not just a widow in mourning. She was a woman of imperial lineage, the granddaughter of Augustus, determined to protect her children and avenge Germanicus. But her bravery soon became a burden. Tiberius did not tolerate opposition, especially from a woman who, in the midst of grief, defied his authority. First came the accusations. Whispers spread through the Senate. Agrippina was conspiring against the emperor, inciting rebellion among the soldiers who still venerated Germanicus. Then came the exiles. One by one, the family's allies were removed, thrown into prisons or condemned to the silence of distant provinces. And then, repression struck at the heart of the family. Caligula's older brother, Nero, was imprisoned on charges of treason. Drusus, the other brother, was confined to a dungeon, where he slowly withered away, dying of hunger. Agrippina, who once walked proudly through the streets of Rome, was forcibly taken to a remote island. There, deprived of food and comfort, she was forced to endure years of suffering before succumbing to hunger and despair. But one name remained untouched: Caligula. He, the boy who had grown up in the military camps, was spared, but not out of mercy. In Tiberius's eyes, he was still too young to be a threat. Instead of being killed, he was taken to the island of Capri, where the emperor ruled in an increasingly paranoid and cruel manner. There, in the isolated palace on the cliffs, young Caligula learned his most valuable lesson. He saw how power was maintained not just through force, but through fear. He understood that to survive, it wasn't enough to be strong. One had to be shrewd, knowing when to bend and when to strike. He witnessed everything: betrayals, executions, cruel games Tiberius played to feed his sadism. And above all, he learned to hide his intentions. The boy who had lost his family to the poison of politics was now growing in the lair of his greatest enemy. But he would never forget. Never. In the isolation of the palace on Capri, far from the gossip and intrigues of Rome, the young man who would one day be called Caligula learned the art of dissimulation. In an environment where power manifested through whispers and cutting glances, he became an attentive spectator of the maneuvers and loyalty games of a court dominated by Emperor Tiberius. In cold corridors and dark halls, every gesture and every word from the courtiers was studied, as if they were lessons in survival. The atmosphere was tense, where trust was a luxury, and every conversation could hide an imminent betrayal. Caligula, although still a child, already realized that silence and caution could be his best weapons to stay out of reach of the persecutions and punishments that plagued his family. While others bent to the ruler's fear and fury, he learned to adapt, to read the signs, and to keep his feelings in check. His youth was his shield. His apparent innocence concealed a sharp mind that absorbed every lesson from the treacherous environment he lived in. The ostentatious parties and superficial celebrations of the court were merely facades to mask the true nature of power, a complex web of alliances and suspicions. There, amidst veiled dialogues and whispered conspiracies, the young emperor was forged. With his eyes wide open to the intricacies of a cruel government, he began to understand that the path to survival lay in knowing when to bend and when to keep his dignity hidden. This school of hardness and cunning silently prepared him for the day when the reins of Rome would be placed in his hands. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Rome breathed a sigh of relief. The empire, mired in the tension and distrust that had marked the years of his reign, could finally free itself from the shadow of his tyranny. But what Rome didn't know was that, instead of relief, what was coming was a change of nature even more unpredictable. Caligula, who had spent his youth in forced exile, now found himself before a unique opportunity. Although the empire was largely shaken by Tiberius's death, his ascendancy was undeniable. He was the son of Germanicus, the people's hero, and the connection of his name with the greatness of his lineage could not be ignored. And as if fate had prepared the stage for his rise, the Praetorian Guard, which held the power to decide who would sit on the throne, turned to him. In the eyes of the soldiers, he was not just the last remnant of the Augustus dynasty. He was a promise. Rome longed for renewal. The political elite was tired of Tiberius's coldness, and the people yearned for a figure who would bring them hope. Caligula's name, laden with glory and fame, was the answer to these longings. When the Praetorian Guard proclaimed Caligula emperor, the streets of Rome erupted in euphoria. He was young, charismatic, and above all, the son of Germanicus. The city was lit up with celebrations, and the people cried out for a prosperous future. In the first days of his reign, Caligula was hailed as the savior, the man who would bring Rome back to its former glory. However, behind the smiles and acclamations, something else was taking shape. The young emperor, who seemed to be the promise of a new era, was beginning to show signs that the power he now possessed would not be used in the way the empire expected. There was something unsettling behind his facade of kindness and generosity. He knew how to manipulate the masses, how to win the people's hearts. But how far was he willing to go to secure his authority? The stage was set, and Caligula was about to reveal a version of Rome that few could imagine. After his rise, a period of light filled the capital. Rome was awakening from a sleep of fear and distrust. The young ruler, with a smile that soothed and decrees that promised renewal, quickly ushered in an era of indulgence and reconstruction. Populist measures were announced. Debts were forgiven, exiles invited back, and grand celebrations filled the streets. The squares transformed into stages of festivity, where artists and poets extolled the new dawn. Soldiers received honors that reinforced their prestige, while citizens rejoiced in the sense that an era of injustices was finally coming to an end. Every decree, every gesture, seemed to herald a future full of possibilities, where the scars of the past could begin to heal. Yet, even amid this vibrant atmosphere, the nuances of uncertainty remained hidden. The mood was optimistic, but behind the glow of celebrations, the emperor was already showing signs of ambition and hints of a fate that would prove to be more complex than the simple hope of the early days. Thus, Rome enjoyed a fleeting phase of relief and joy as the new reign began to write its first chapters, full of promises and, at the same time, omens that only time would reveal. After the first months of glory, a sudden setback shook the young emperor. A mysterious illness overtook him, causing fever and weakness that challenged not only his physical vigor, but also his very essence. During the long days of pain and restlessness, as doctors fought to identify the cause, Caligula underwent an almost mystical experience. In the solitude of his bed, the emperor came face to face with human vulnerability. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the idea that nothing is immune to fragility. However, in this state of convalescence, something unexpected blossomed, an internal rebirth. The suffering provoked intense introspection, awakening in him a new awareness of himself and the treacherous environment surrounding him. With his recovery, the brightness of optimism gave way to a darker, more distrustful stance. That illness, beyond weakening his body, instilled a deep fear of the intentions of his allies and enemies. Every glance, every whisper, began to be interpreted as a threat. Thus, the emperor, once a symbol of hope, transformed into a figure marked by paranoia, a man who saw conspiracies where there were none, fueling a new regime of harsh and authoritarian measures. This transformation, both in spirit and behavior, began to reveal the contours of a government that would be remembered for its eccentricity and fear. The episode of his illness not only altered his personal fate, but also sowed the seeds of a power that would feed on terror and distrust, paving the way for an era of increasingly impetuous and controversial decisions. Caligula's transformation led him down a path of systematic brutality, where fear became the foundation of his reign. In a scenario where any deviation in behavior, or even a murmur of discontent was seen as treason, the emperor established an atmosphere of terror that permeated every corner of the empire. Punishments were applied with almost ritualistic rigor. Summary trials were hastily arranged, often held amidst crowds, so that the spectacle of violence became a public warning. Courtrooms turned into macabre arenas, where defendants deprived of defense were sentenced to death by arbitrary deliberations and commissions acting under the absolute authority of Caligula. The execution of Gemellus, the co-heir whose fate symbolized the emperor's contempt for any potential threat, was just the first of many bloody rituals. High-ranking senators, revered former officers, and even close friends were targeted. Each found themselves ensnared in fabricated accusations, manipulated evidence, and confessions extracted under torture. The methods employed ranged from swift stabbings to decapitations, always accompanied by speeches that distorted the memory of the condemned, turning them into living examples of disobedience. In the palace corridors, the whisper of an imminent betrayal was enough to trigger a new wave of purges. The Praetorian Guard, once a symbol of loyalty, began playing a dual role, protecting the emperor and being an instrument of his vengeance. In public ceremonies, soldiers displayed weapons stained with the blood of Caligula's enemies, reinforcing the idea that even the slightest dissent would not be tolerated. This cascade of violence spared even the sacred spaces of Roman tradition. In the forums and squares, statues and monuments were stained by bloodshed, while the people, powerless in the face of the spectacle of horror, watched their faith and security disintegrating before their eyes. The atmosphere of terror instilled by the emperor was so oppressive that even the city itself seemed to sigh under the weight of constant losses. Amidst this scenario, Roman society found itself divided between disbelief and paralyzing fear. Those who still dared to speak whispered in alleys and corners, knowing their words could seal their fates. Caligula, fed by this spiral of violence, showed an almost theatrical coldness when pronouncing sentences, each followed by a gaze that seemed to pierce the souls of the condemned. Thus, the reign that began with promises of renewal turned into a cycle of relentless punishment, leaving a trail of blood and distrust that would mark Rome forever. The empire, once full of hopes and dreams, became a stage where terror was the protagonist and justice a distant memory of what it had once been. As the reign plunged further into the shadows of despotism, the emperor found in himself not just the power to rule, but the conviction that his essence transcended mere mortality. Amidst the echoes of executions and conspiracies, Caligula began to rise as something more than a mere leader. He saw himself as the incarnation of a deity. In the early days of his new era of terror, decrees were proclaimed with the authority of the gods. He ordered altars to be erected, temples dedicated solely to his image, where citizens were to kneel and prostrate in reverence. His decrees were not mere words, but public rituals that transformed politics into a cult. The streets of Rome filled with statues and inscriptions, all exalting his divinity, and every temple built was a declaration that for Caligula, the divine and the imperial were one and the same. The emperor did not limit himself to these symbolic manifestations. In grand ceremonies, he appeared dressed in attire reminiscent of the gods of Olympus, with laurel crowns and sparkling adornments, demonstrating to the people that his authority was of celestial origin. Disguised as ancient deities, he began demanding worship rituals that resembled prayers to immortal gods. This new personal cult quickly surpassed the conventional limits, challenging deeply rooted beliefs in Roman tradition and provoking revolt among the more conservative, both among senators and religious leaders. The impact was immediate and profound. While some allowed themselves to be enchanted by the spectacle, others looked on in horror at the rise of a ruler who dared to place his own image above the gods revered for centuries. Tension spread throughout the empire, fueling the idea that the line between the human and the divine had been dangerously blurred. Thus, the emperor, in his self-proclamation, not only consolidated his power, but also established a regime of worship that would forever change Rome's faith and politics. With the emperor immersed in his own divine exaltation, the ancient Roman institutions began to undergo a brutal and irreverent transformation. Empowered by his personal cult, Caligula started treating the Senate not as a body of wise men, but as mere extras in his grand spectacle. In solemn meetings, where once vital matters for the empire were debated, the senators were now subjected to rituals of contempt. The emperor would appear before them in opulent attire and with haughty gestures, staring at them with a gaze that stripped away any trace of respect. Each session turned into a theater of ridicule, where outdated speeches were interrupted by laughter and veiled insults, aimed at undermining the authority of the advisors. In the midst of this affront, the ancient pillars of power fragmented. Caligula ordered the senators to bow before his image, forcing them to witness public ceremonies that defied the dignity of their positions. The environment, once filled with measured debates, had now become a stage for displays of arrogance and disdain, where any attempted argument was smothered by the unyielding force of the new order. This systematic humiliation eroded Rome's centuries-old traditions, while the emperor, with his arrogance, drew a new path for governance. In the eyes of the citizens, the scene was a shock. The guardians of ancient wisdom, now reduced to mere objects of mockery, served as a painful reminder that the empire was being redirected to the whims of a ruler who saw himself above all authority. Thus, the breakdown of reverence for the Senate not only symbolized a revolution at the heart of power, but also foreshadowed the collapse of the structures that had upheld Rome for generations. Every insult and every act of disrespect paved the way for an era in which the self-proclaimed God reigned without room for the councils that had once guided the greatness of the eternal city. Amid increasingly baffling actions, one narrative stood out and shocked even more the traditional yearnings of Rome: the exaltation of the horse Incitatus. It is said that the emperor, immersed in his own divine madness, saw in the animal not just a companion, but a symbol of his revolutionary and absurd vision of power. Incitatus, a horse of imposing stature and haughty gaze, was treated with unimaginable splendor. His stables were transformed into royal chambers, adorned with marble and decorated with shining jewels. Banquets were held, and the horse enjoyed a routine that exceeded any mortal standard, serving as a testimony to Caligula's disdain for convention. The height of this extravagance came when the emperor, in an act that defied all political logic, announced his intention to appoint Incitatus to the high office of consul. This proposal, full of irony and disdain for the senatorial institutions, was seen both as a demonstration of absolute power and as a fierce mockery of the ancient councils of Rome. As senators and citizens debated in shock and indignation, the animal became a symbol of imperial excess, reflecting the profound rupture between reality and the fantasy of absolute power. Incitatus, the horse who had never expected to see his name associated with the annals of politics, became the epicenter of a scandal that would echo through generations, highlighting that under Caligula's reign, even reason seemed to be subjugated by eccentricity and madness. Throughout his reign, Caligula was not content with merely being the ruler of Rome. He aspired to be a mythical figure, a hero worthy of stories and songs. In his relentless pursuit of glory and an immortal legacy, he decided that his military campaigns would be a spectacle of his grandeur, though often lacking any real strategic purpose. One of the most emblematic and ridiculous campaigns of his leadership was his attempt to conquer Britain. The Roman army, accustomed to relentless wars and bloody battles, marched to the coast with great hopes, expecting a real invasion of barbarian lands. But upon reaching the British coast, what did the emperor do? Instead of advancing into battle, Caligula ordered his soldiers to collect seashells, declaring that he had conquered the ocean. He proclaimed a naval victory over the god Neptune, as if it were an achievement worthy of his divine position, and commanded his troops to erect trophies made from the shells, as if they were spoils of war. This victorious army returned to Rome, not with riches and victories, but with surreal tales of a campaign that, in practice, had never taken place. The people, who had initially celebrated him, were perplexed by the farce, but the imperial court merely applauded the gesture as a reaffirmation of his absolute power. Another equally bizarre episode took place in Germania, a region famous for its fierce resistance to Roman incursions. Caligula ordered his army to march to the Rhine River, where his soldiers built an improvised bridge over the waters. Instead of confronting the Germans, what happened was even more absurd. Caligula had his men collect tributes of victory, as if merely crossing the river was a great conquest. The expedition resulted in no real combat, but in yet another theatrical performance where the emperor, once again, placed himself at the center of the stage, disregarding the actual military value of the mission. These episodes not only destroyed any military credibility Caligula might have had, but they also exposed the flaws in his rule. His obsession with fame and personal glorification, to the point of disregarding the basic principles of war and strategy, revealed the fragility of an empire being led by a leader who saw reality as just a stage for his own spectacle. Caligula's military campaigns, instead of reinforcing Rome's power, became jokes that echoed through the empire, discrediting him further. As Caligula's self-proclamation as a god and his eccentricities reached new extremes, Rome began to suffer the financial consequences of his reign. The endless feasts, grand spectacles, and the construction of temples in his honor drained the empire's coffers. The senatorial class and the wealthiest in the empire found themselves increasingly affected by the emperor's exorbitant spending, while the common people silently suffered, watching the wealth being used to feed the whims of the ruler. Caligula spent staggering sums on projects of personal glorification. He built a massive palace, adorned with the finest marbles and precious stones, featuring hanging gardens and ornate fountains, all at the expense of the public treasury. To fund these extravagances, he imposed high taxes on the provinces and confiscated riches from temples and private properties, further weakening the economy. The same wealth that should have fueled Rome's greatness was being redirected to ensure the luxury and eternal worship of the emperor. Additionally, Caligula held games and competitions with exorbitant costs, where he himself, as the center of attention, displayed himself as a hero, competing with gladiators and wild animals in events that seemed more like vanity spectacles than celebrations of strength or honor. The Colosseum, traditionally the site of great Roman victories, was now transformed into a stage where the emperor himself took center stage in the contests, always seeking to reinforce the idea of his divine superiority. The most tragic aspect of this situation was the paradox that unfolded in Rome. While Caligula sank deeper into his excesses, the common people began to feel the strains of a declining economy. Inflation increased, and the Roman provinces, exhausted by high taxes, began to revolt against the abuses of the imperial court. Those who had once seen Caligula as a savior now started to question the stability of an empire that was sinking under the weight of debt and financial unsustainability. Caligula's desire for absolute power, combined with his impulses for personal exhibition, put Rome in a vulnerable position. He not only undermined the political and moral strength of his governance, but also the economic foundation that sustained the empire. Thus, the empire, which should have been a machine of efficiency and stability, found itself increasingly consumed by the very excesses of its emperor. When the empire was being torn apart by excess, Caligula dared to challenge not only Roman traditions, but also the very foundations of a people's faith. In an act that bordered on insolence, the emperor decreed that his statue be installed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a sacred place where no human representation, let alone that of a ruler, should defile the sanctity of Jewish monotheism. This decision, made amid the growing madness of his reign, caused a wave of panic among the Jews, who saw it as a direct affront to their identity and beliefs. The community, skilled in preserving its traditions and protected by a strong spiritual heritage, did not hesitate to respond. Silently, but with firm determination, religious leaders and citizens united to resist the emperor's decree, pressing for respect and the preservation of their ancestral values. Tension spread through the alleys and squares, where heated debates mixed fear and indignation. While some called for a reconciliation that would save the integrity of the temple, others advocated for an unwavering stance of resistance against the desecration. The episode ultimately sparked a conflict that threatened to ignite not just a religious, but also a political, cultural confrontation, placing the empire on the brink of a devastating cultural war. Caligula, immersed in his delusion of grandeur, ignored the pleas and protests that spread, firmly convinced that his will was unquestionable. This emblematic episode not only deepened the rift between the emperor and the Jewish community, but it also eroded the credibility of a regime that was already headed for self-destruction, making it clear that for Caligula, reason and tradition were mere obstacles on the path to his own divine exaltation. As the first signs of opposition and discontent began to spread, Caligula retreated into a cocoon of distrust and paranoia. His empire, which once seemed to be in the hands of a dynamic and charismatic ruler, was now being governed by a man who saw betrayal in every corner, in every furtive glance, and in every whispered word in the streets of Rome. The climate of terror intensified as the emperor, haunted by the idea of being overthrown, began to isolate himself. The palace doors, once open for public celebrations and political gatherings, closed. Caligula began surrounding himself with guards at all times, distrusting even his closest allies. Anyone who approached him was viewed with suspicion. Any thoughtless gesture or misplaced word could be interpreted as a threat to his authority. Caligula's paranoia extended even to the members of his own family. He saw potential traitors disguised as relatives. His own wife, Caesonia, was treated with distrust, and the courtiers who once enjoyed imperial favor now lived under the constant shadow of fear, dreading that a suspicious glance or a misinterpreted gesture might be the last thing they did. The emperor began to distance himself even further from the outside world, creating a distorted version of reality where, as a living deity, he saw himself surrounded by invisible enemies trying to usurp his power. He altered his routine, frequently changing residences, sleeping in different places every night, in an attempt to avoid any possible plot against his life. He even became suspicious of his most loyal troops, like the Praetorian Guard, who had once acclaimed him as emperor, but now were viewed with caution, as if any soldier could be a traitor waiting for an opportunity. This growing alienation not only weakened the empire, but also transformed Caligula himself into an isolated and unstable figure. His subjects, once charmed by his charisma, now feared his unpredictability. The empire, which was supposed to be a model of order and stability, was starting to fragment under the weight of an emperor who believed he was constantly surrounded by conspiracies and betrayals. And as often happens with those who become prisoners of their own mind, Caligula's reign became more erratic, plunging ancient Rome into unprecedented chaos. As Caligula's paranoia grew and his cruelty became unbearable, the empire, which had once venerated him, found itself on the brink of collapse. His own allies, senators, officers, and even members of the Praetorian Guard were exhausted by his tyranny. The empire, which had long been sustained by alliances and mutual respect, was now fragmenting due to the lack of trust in a leader who had risen above all, including the laws and traditions. What seemed like an unbeatable reign began to crack from within. Caligula, isolated in his delusions, continued hunting down and eliminating anyone he considered a threat to his power. But what he didn't see was that the very structure that had placed him on the throne was falling apart beneath his feet. Discontent among the military and the Roman elite quietly grew until, finally, a conspiracy began to take shape in the shadows. The conspiracy was carefully planned by members of the Praetorian Guard, including Cassius Chaerea, a commander who had been publicly humiliated by Caligula and had finally decided that the empire could no longer bear the weight of such an erratic and insane ruler. Along with other conspirators, Chaerea organized a coup to end the emperor's reign and restore order in Rome. On January 24th, 41 AD, the moment arrived. During one of the many public processions in which Caligula displayed his pomp and sovereignty, the conspirators saw the perfect opportunity. The emperor was walking, as usual, down a corridor of the palace, surrounded by only a small number of guards. Cassius Chaerea, with deadly precision, was the first to strike, stabbing Caligula in the side. Other conspirators quickly followed, attacking him with sharp blades until the emperor fell, finally silenced. Caligula's death was swift but brutal. The one who saw himself as a living god was brought down by his own guards, in an act that would become a symbol of the decay of his government. The emperor's body, bleeding and bloodied, was left behind as a reminder that even gods can be killed. The impact of Caligula's death reverberated throughout Rome. While the conspirators believed that the fall of a tyrant would mark the end of an era of terror, the city was plunged into uncertainty. The empire was now without a leader, and the struggle for power among rival factions began to take over the streets. However, Caligula's death did not bring peace or immediate stability. Instead, it opened the doors to more political struggles and succession disputes that would mark the next years of the Roman Empire. After the brutal death of Caligula, a new phase of uncertainty began for Rome. But for the conspirators who had overthrown the emperor, the risk of a possible revenge from Caligula's bloodline needed to be eradicated immediately. The empire, which had lost its leader, now faced the challenge of preventing the memory of his dynasty from threatening the stability of the new regime. The first victim of the conspirators' revenge was his wife, Caesonia. Considered by many to be loyal until death, Caesonia was the emperor's wife who, in his last years, had begun to share in Caligula's growing paranoia. Even though she was a relatively quiet figure in Roman politics, her marriage to the emperor made her a direct threat, as anyone associated with the imperial family could be used as a banner by those who wanted to restore order. Caesonia, as the wife of a now-dead ruler, was cruelly executed shortly after Caligula's assassination, with no chance of defense. Her fate was sealed the moment the conspiracy was realized. But the cruelty did not stop there. The true threat to the continuity of Caligula's dynasty lay in his daughter, still a child. She represented the last hope for a future of Caligula's line, and therefore needed to be eliminated, along with any trace of his lineage. Thus, the emperor's daughter, who was no older than a few years old, was also sentenced to death. The conspirators, fearing that any attempt to claim the throne through her might awaken popular sympathies and weaken their control, did not hesitate to eliminate the child, ensuring that no legitimate heir of Caligula's dynasty would remain. The execution of his wife and daughter marked the definitive end of Caligula's succession line. His dynasty, which had promised so much glory and power, was now wiped out, mercilessly eliminated to ensure that no descendant could seek revenge or claim the throne. This act of cruelty not only reflects the fear and insecurity that permeated the post-Caligula empire, but also the extreme desperation of the conspirators, who believed that the only way to restore order and secure control was by eradicating any symbol of the tyranny they had just overthrown. However, in carrying out these executions, the conspirators failed to realize that they were, in fact, deepening the political rift in Rome. The empire, which was already directionless, now found itself engulfed in the violence and instability of a coup that did not bring peace, but only the emptiness of destruction. With Caligula's death and the eradication of his family, Rome found itself in a state of absolute chaos. The empire, once led by an emperor who believed himself to be divine, was now without a clear ruler, and the Senate, the Praetorian Guard, and military factions fought for control. It was a moment of vulnerability in which any figure who could offer stability and lead Rome out of the crisis would be welcomed with great interest. But who would that figure be? In this power vacuum, an unlikely figure emerged: Claudius, Caligula's uncle, who had been largely ignored during his nephew's reign. Claudius, physically fragile, with health problems and a shy, introverted nature, had never been seen as a threat. His name was far removed from political disputes, and many considered him an irrelevant figure, almost a curiosity within the Roman nobility. However, this lack of prominence made him an ideal choice for the conspirators who now controlled the situation. While the military and the Roman elite were immersed in power struggles, Claudius remained off the radar. He, who had been treated with disdain and neglect by Caligula, was found hiding in the corridors of the palace, seemingly defenseless and distant from the circles of power. The conspirators, probably underestimating his ambition and intelligence, ended up seeking his alliance. The Praetorian Guard, which had been crucial in Caligula's downfall, supported his rise, considering him a viable option to restore order and maintain stability. Surprisingly, Claudius was proclaimed emperor. When the announcement was made, many of those who had conspired against Caligula were shocked, as he was not an obvious choice. However, contrary to his fragile image and frail health, Claudius revealed a political astuteness that few had recognized before. He quickly formed alliances with the officers of the Praetorian Guard and the senators who were dissatisfied with the excesses of the previous rulers. Although initially considered an insignificant figure, Claudius played his cards skillfully. He won the loyalty of the troops by offering generous bonuses and ensuring the empire's stability. He also sought to restore the confidence of the elites, claiming that his government would be based on tradition and the institutions of Rome, something that Caligula had completely ignored. In no time, Claudius was seen not only as an improvised ruler, but as a solution to the crisis that had taken hold of the empire. Claudius' rise to the throne marked not just the end of an era of chaos, but also the transition to a new chapter in Rome's history. He, the underestimated and disregarded man, now ruled the world's most powerful empire. And unlike Caligula, his policies were focused on attempting to stabilize Roman society and restore the order that had been destroyed by the excesses of his predecessors. Claudius wasn't the idealized figure the Romans had envisioned, but he proved to be a shrewd survivor, able to restore hope in an empire on the brink of collapse. The reign of Caligula, although brief, left an indelible mark on Rome's history, with his memory becoming synonymous with tyranny, excess, and madness. The emperor, once seen as a promise of renewal, became a warning about the dangers of absolute power and the descent into insanity. His attempt to elevate himself to divine status and his extravagant whims not only distorted Roman institutions, but also showed how an empire could be torn apart by the obsession of a single man. The cult of his personality was undoubtedly one of the most shocking aspects of his reign. Caligula presented himself as a living god, demanding that the people of Rome worship him in temples dedicated exclusively to him. He turned the city into a stage for his own vanity, with statues of his face spread throughout the empire, and required his subjects to venerate him, defying centuries of religious tradition. This self-exaltation not only irritated the Roman elite, but also sparked revolts in distant places like Judea, where his imposition of a statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem created a religious crisis that nearly triggered a revolt. But Caligula's legacy wasn't limited to his religious eccentricities. His administration was marked by a series of actions that, instead of strengthening the empire, weakened it. His ridiculous military campaigns, such as the conquest of the ocean in Britain, and his economic policies that drained the empire's coffers, revealed his complete disconnection from reality. The unchecked extravagance, while the people and provinces faced growing economic hardships, led Rome into a state of fragility, with resources being wasted on personal whims. The impact of his death, however, was both a relief and a harbinger of a turbulent transition. His fall, which could have restored order, also exposed the empire's fragility and the lack of a clear succession system, leading to a power vacuum that Rome could not ignore. But in the end, what remained of Caligula was the lesson that a ruler, no matter how brilliant or charismatic, cannot overshadow the foundations that sustain an empire. His tyranny was a painful reminder that the greatness of Rome couldn't be defined by the will of one man alone, but by the harmony of the institutions that kept the empire united and strong. Caligula, the Mad Emperor, may be remembered for his extravagant eccentricities and his insane quest for worship, but his true legacy lies in the portrayal of an empire on the brink of decadence, a reflection of the dangers of absolute power and the loss of connection to reason. And although the Roman Empire moved on, he left behind an indelible mark, a warning that even the greatest empires can be toppled by the madness of a single man. And so ends the story of Caligula, one of the most fascinating and controversial emperors of Rome. His reign, marked by madness and tyranny, shows us how absolute power can corrupt even the greatest of leaders. But like all great stories, his legacy still resonates today, as a warning about the dangers of vanity and the obsession with control. The figure of Caligula, one of the most enigmatic and feared emperors of ancient Rome, has always fascinated popular culture. His reign, marked by unpredictable and often cruel behavior, has never ceased to be fertile ground for cinematic, literary, and even artistic productions. But how can such a controversial historical figure become an icon of the media? The 1979 film Caligula, directed by Tinto Brass and produced by Bob Guccione, founder of Penthouse magazine, became one of the most iconic and controversial examples of this representation. Its combination of explicit scenes and a portrayal of Caligula's madness not only caused a scandal, but also sparked a reflection on the limits of creative freedom in cinema. The image of Caligula as a tyrant completely disconnected from reality, making erratic and cruel decisions, became ingrained in the public's mind. However, what many may not realize is the impact of these representations. Through the media, Caligula became synonymous with unchecked tyranny and imperial decadence, something that reflects a simplified view of his history. The irony is that despite the immense negativity surrounding him, the Roman Empire was in fact a reflection of the society he ruled, full of complexities and ambiguities. Over time, these images built the popular narrative around him, a figure more mythical than historical, and these influences still echo in modern productions. The cruel, insane, and promiscuous emperor continues to be an archetype explored in cinema and literature, where the line between legend and reality often blurs. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, to which Caligula belonged, is a vivid example of the complexity of Roman imperial power. When Caligula ascended to the throne, he seemed to be a promise of renewal for the empire. His reign, however, took a devastating turn, not only because of his brutality and eccentric behavior, but also because of the repercussions within his own dynasty. After his death, his succession was left to Claudius, his uncle, a figure who seemed to have no remarkable qualities to rule, but who, surprisingly, brought stability to the empire. Claudius, though more peaceful and pragmatic, didn't escape the shadow of Caligula's reign. His rise to power was marked by a relentless effort to restore order and minimize the damage to the image of the dynasty, which had been deeply scarred by his nephew's rule. However, Caligula's legacy also had a profound effect on Nero, the last emperor of the dynasty. Nero, though later known for his own tyranny and excesses, was indirectly shaped by the shadow of Caligula's reign. The relationship between power and cruelty became a cycle difficult to break. Thus, the Julio-Claudian dynasty continued to be marked by instability, and Caligula's presence in Roman memory was not easy to erase. His figure, as a representation of excess, corruption, and absolute power, shaped what would be Roman politics and imperial succession for many years. The assassination of Caligula was a reaction to an empire that could no longer sustain the brutality of its ruler. On January 24, 41 AD, the emperor was fatally wounded by members of the Praetorian Guard, following a conspiracy involving Senate officials and even his own wife. What seemed like the end of an era of excess and tyranny became a turning point for Roman politics, with immediate consequences that reverberated throughout the empire's structure. After his death, the conspirators, although initially taking power, quickly found themselves in a struggle for control. The Roman population, who had lived in fear under Caligula, showed relief but also uncertainty about what would come next. The rapid rise of Claudius to the throne was a pragmatic move. Though not the ideal leader for many, his ascension represented the need to restore order and political stability, something the empire desperately needed after the excesses of the previous reign. Caligula's death also brought significant social changes. The Roman elite, tired of the chaos and extravagance of their ruler, began to reassess their view of imperial authority. Caligula's brutality, which had once seemed like a reflection of absolute power, was now seen as something that needed to be eradicated to preserve the future of Rome. The reforms and political transitions after his death made it clear that, although the Roman Empire was solid in structure, it would never be immune to the consequences of an out-of-control government. Thus, Caligula's impact extended far beyond his death, affecting not only the future of his successors, but also the history of the empire he helped to transform. If you enjoyed this journey through Roman history and want to learn more about other emperors and incredible events from antiquity, don't forget to leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of this story, and if you have suggestions for other topics, share them with us. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss any chapters of this fascinating journey through the past. Until the next video, and remember, history never stops surprising us.